This is session number 11 of our early Roman Emperors series, and this last one in the series I've called the Flavian Reconstruction. I think it's an entirely just title because it is the Flavians, it is this dynasty of three men, of Vespasian, of Titus, and of Domitian, who are the intermediary stage between the julio-claudians, who always have an air of the provisional about them, and the more regular, settled Roman emperors, or the more regular, settled imperial system that you see emerging at the end of the 1st century, in which it is universally acknowledged, even by the most conservative of the aristocrats, that the Republic is dead and that the imperial system is the new constitution. This opening slide, of course, is taken from the Arch of Titus in Rome, and it shows the carrying through Rome in triumph of the spoils from the sack of Jerusalem. We'll say more about that later on. As far as the Romans were concerned, the Jewish war was a short-term nuisance. It was over, and it's something you forgot to move on to the next issue. Whereas, of course, if you are a Jew or a Christian, it is one of the, in fact it may be the most important event of the entire Flavian dynasty. And so we will come to the sack of Jerusalem a little later and talk about that at greater length than the Romans themselves would have thought appropriate. But here are the three men of the Flavian dynasty, and I do assure you I did not go out of my way to find the most grotesque representations of these emperors. I could perhaps have found a statue of Vespasian where he had a few clothes on, but I think there is something that emerges from these representations. If you look at the Julio-Claudians, if you look at statues of Augustus, of Tiberius, of Caligula, even of Claudius and then of Nero, what you see is people who are entirely at home with these somewhat idealized images of themselves. We can be reasonably sure that in later life Tiberius had progressed far beyond a certain plainness into outright ugliness. There is some doubt as to whether Caligula ever looked quite as his statues portray him. But there is something convincing, there is something impressive about these statues, the representations of the first of the emperors. Once you get to these three men, they do put me in mind. Yes. There was a time in my life when I spent a lot of time in courts. Not in the criminal courts, but there was a criminal court attached. And I would often see young men coming into the court building. They were all wearing rather nice, smart suits, but you could see from the way the suits fitted on them and from their general body language and their general demeanour that suits were somewhat alien to their normal clothing. It was something that they had put on for an occasion and that they felt very self-conscious in them. When you think of those young men, have a look at these three representations. These are men who are rather surprised that they are emperors. It's not something that they had expected, and it's not something that they feel they can carry off particularly well. But they are emperors, and they are going to try to the best of their ability to live up to the role. I suppose we can be quite sure that when Vespasian became emperor, he didn't look like that. His face may have done, but that's about it. Titus, if you'll pardon the snobbery, he looks more like a tradesman than an emperor. Domitian, he's a little more convincing, but you can see that he is trying to imitate Augustus. But these are the three men of the Flavian dynasty. Although the last of these, Domitian, has a bad reputation, the first two have golden reputations as far as the surviving histories are concerned, and a very strong case can be made for Domitian, but whatever you think of them as individuals, these are the men who stabilized the imperial system and made sure that it would survive more or less unchanged, though gradually evolving, for the next 300 years. Let's have a look at these three men. If you want to look at the family histories of Augustus, or perhaps not Augustus, but of Julius Caesar and of Tiberius and of all the subsequent emperors in that house, you will see their ability to trace their ancestry back far beyond the late Republic, far beyond the Middle and Early Republic. They can trace their ancestry all the way back to the men who travelled from Troy to Italy with Aeneas, and beyond that they can trace their ancestry back to various deities, to Venus, for example, as Julius Caesar did. Where the Flavians are concerned, the earliest known member of the family is a rather lowly person, Titus Flavius Petro. He was a centurion, not an officer, a centurion, a non-commissioned officer in the army of Pompey during the civil wars. His most notable accomplishment during the civil wars was at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, I think, where he ran away from the battle in disgrace. But although he had not covered himself in glory in the civil wars, he did have one great advantage over those people who did cover themselves in glory, and that is that he survived. He survived through the various changes of regime, and during the reign of Augustus, he made a most advantageous marriage. His son then made another very good marriage, and so the family was raised up in the course of 2 generations by advantageous marriages to not quite the upper reaches of the nobility, but they found themselves in the senatorial aristocracy. The family finances were also greatly helped by a time in Asia in the 20s AD collecting taxes. 9 AD, Vespasian is born. He doesn't do anything outstanding for the main part of his career. He has instead a solid military and administrative career under all of the julio-claudian emperors from Tiberius onwards. The histories that we have do their best to suggest that Vespasian was out of favour during the reigns of Caligula and Nero, but there is no particular evidence that this is the case. There is a story that during the later years of Nero, Vespasian was sitting through a musical performance by the emperor and fell asleep, and thereby fell out of favour. There may be some truth in that. However, when the Jews rose in revolt in 66, Vespasian was the man chosen by Nero to go out and suppress the revolt, which indicates that he was not under any particular cloud at the time. Vespasian has 2 sons. He has Titus, born in 39, and he has another nice, solid military career. You then have Domitian, born in 51. He was rather young at the fall of Nero. He was only 17. He stayed in Rome throughout. Vespasian and Titus were sent off east to deal with the Jewish Revolt. Domitian remained in Rome. He was too young to go anywhere else, and perhaps he was being kept in Rome as a means of keeping some control over Vespasian, because, remember, there were only about 120,000 regular troops to defend the entire empire, And it seems that when Vespasian turned up in Judea in 66 AD, he was at the head of an army of 80,000 men, which suggests that all of the frontiers of the empire had been stripped of men, including the critical Rhine frontier, and that Vespasian was the best armed man in the entire empire. And since Nero was nothing if not paranoid, it would not be surprising if he were to keep the younger son in Rome as a hostage. Certainly during the reign of Vitellius, Domitian was kept in Rome as a hostage. However, although Domitian's role in the crisis of the 69 civil war is not entirely clear, he does seem to have handled himself and the family business with considerable ability. These men together, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, preside over a social revolution in the empire. The ancient families, the upper reaches of the senatorial aristocracy, are dying out. They're dying out partly because the emperors keep having them put to death, but they're also dying out because families do eventually die out, and they're being moved aside, and they're being replaced by much more recent men, the lower nobility of the Italian peninsula, and increasingly by the entry of wealthy eastern provincials into the politics and government of the empire. In the reigns of the julio-claudian emperors, the government of the empire, of course it was partly given out to various slaves and freedmen of the emperors, but for the most part the government of the empire was in the hands of the emperor and was shared, so far as the emperor thought fit, with the senatorial aristocracy. With these three men, the empire and its government are shared out between the emperors and a much larger and a much less wealthy nobility in Italy, and also with the wealthy or noble classes far beyond Italy, men from Spain, men from Asia Minor, men from Greece, whatever. The empire is moving from the city of Rome plus dependent provinces into an empire that spans the entire Mediterranean world plus hinterland, which has Rome as its capital. Oh, here is the family tree, and you'll see that it's a much less cluttered family tree than the Julio-Claudians. You don't have semi-incestuous marriages all over the place and bizarre adoptions. What you have here is a fairly normal family. Indeed, the Flavian dynasty is notable for the fact that when Vespasian died, his eldest son, Titus, took over, and when Titus died unexpectedly without issue, the purple, or perhaps the crown you could call it, moved almost automatically to his younger brother Domitian, whereas with the earlier emperors it was always a matter of some doubt as to who would be the next emperor. The establishment. In 68 AD, while Nero was stabbing himself to death in Rome, and you have a political crisis and a potential civil war in the western provinces, Vespasian and Titus are occupied in what they would doubtless have considered the thoroughly innocent pursuit of besieging Jerusalem with their army of 80,000 men. Because they have an army of 80,000 men, and because they're very close to Egypt and they have potential control over the grain supply, also since the brother of Vespasian, Titus Flavius Sabinus, is in charge of the city garrison in Rome, many people expect that Vespasian will throw his hat into the ring. But you see, at this point, the contest for purple is very much a matter for the upper reaches of the senatorial aristocracy. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, they're all fairly upper class, and Vespasian is almost a new man. But whatever the case, when people do suggest to Vespasian, well, Nero's gone, why don't you put yourself up for emperor? Vespasian's answer was rather frosty. He wasn't interested. There was a job to get on with, besieging Jerusalem and crushing the Jewish Revolt. So they sit out the opening moves in the year of the 4 emperors. Vespasian and Titus accept Galba as emperor. They are loyal subjects of the new emperor. They accept Otho as emperor, again loyal subjects. They seem to be inclined to accept Vitellius when he turns up at the head of the Rhine legions as emperor. However, on the 1st of July 69, the army in Judea is rather annoyed that their big boss is refusing to do his duty, and so they acclaim Vespasian as emperor. They tell him, you are the emperor, and there's always, when the army does that to you, the implied condition, or else. Vespasian accepts the purple. He's joined at once by the governor of Syria and the prefect of Egypt, which means that pretty well the entire East declares for Vespasian. There is a renewed civil war, but Vespasian and Titus are first-class military leaders. They have a great deal of legitimacy in the East. The civil war is rather brief. The Vitellian forces are defeated by the Vespasian forces. It seems at first that there's going to be a deal. Vitellius is a realist. He realizes that he's bitten off rather more than he can chew. He hasn't been a particularly good emperor, and now he doesn't have the necessary forces to maintain himself. Why not make a deal? You abdicate, in return for which the new emperor promises to spare your life. Vitellius is on his way to the Temple of Concord in Rome to deposit the imperial regalia and his notice of abdication. He's unfortunately grabbed by the Praetorian Guard, which says, oh, not so quickly, you're the emperor, you've got to stay as emperor. So the deal is off, unfortunately. On the 19th of December 69, there's a skirmish in Rome where Vitellius has reneged on the deal, under duress, but he's reneged on it. Vespasian's brother Sabinus is killed. Domitian escapes from the rather chaotic massacre by pretending to be a worshipper of Isis and spends the night in the house of a supporter. But a day later, Vitellius is dead, and everybody now declares for Vespasian. Domitian comes out of hiding and accepts the empire on behalf of his father. Vespasian is emperor for the next 10 years. No one has a bad word for him. This is from Suetonius, who says nothing good about most of the emperors, but he says nothing particularly bad about Vespasian, except he was rather common. There is no evidence of any innocent person being punished during his reign, except during his absences from Rome, and without his knowledge, or at least against his wishes, and by means of deception. He was even lenient towards Helvidius Priscus, who was alone in calling him by his personal name of Vespasian on his return from Syria, and who as praetor failed to honour the emperor in superscriptions to his decrees. Vespasian showed no sign of anger until Helvidius began to undermine his status by flagrant insolence. Even then, after banishing him, and later signing his death warrant, he was still reluctant to have the execution carried out, sending men to countermand the order, and Helvidius would indeed have been saved if the messengers had not been deceived by a false report that the man was already dead. Vespasian certainly never rejoiced at any man's death, but rather sighed and wept over the sufferings of those who deserved punishment. That may be true. It doesn't sound tremendously likely, but there is no doubt that Vespasian ruled with great moderation. He had a reputation for avarice, but then he did come to power with an empty treasury, and treasuries do need to be filled in one way or another. He also seems to have purged the Senate, not by killing its members, just by removing them and replacing them with his own supporters, many of them from outside Italy, and with his family members. He ruled through a close-knit network of friends and family members. There were, so it's said, repeated conspiracies against Vespasian, and that is hardly surprising. Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, even Nero until the end, had possessed the solid legitimacy that came from the establishment of the empire. They were members of the family of Julius Caesar, or they were members of the family of Augustus once you get to Tiberius, and so they had a natural legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and it would have been difficult for anybody else to step in and say, I am the emperor now. It would have been rather as if somebody were to try moving our own queen aside and putting the crown on his head, saying, I am the new King of England. No, you can't be the King of England unless you belong to the royal family. The crown moves around within that family. It will sometimes not go from father to son, but from father to brother, father to nephew, father to cousin, etc. There was a certain movement around at the end of the 17th century, but there is no way in which anybody from outside that family can become the king. It was rather like that with the julio-claudians. They had the legitimacy of being the legitimate family. Whereas Vespasian, who is he? He's the grandson of some little man who ran away at the Battle of Pharsalus. You know, the one where our great-grandfather was one of the leaders. He's emperor at the moment, but if I can get a conspiracy going, and if I can give the appropriate bribes to the Praetorian Guard, I can step over his blood-stained body and put the wreath on my head, can't I? So Vespasian and Titus and Domitian did face more threats to their position than the julio-claudians ever had, simply because they do not have the solid legitimacy of the first ruling house. Titus, everybody thought that Titus would be a wonderful emperor. He took over in 79 AD on the death of Vespasian, and then he died suddenly in 81 of an infection. That was the end of him. He was followed by his younger brother Domitian, and here is a somewhat unlikely statue of the man, especially once you come to reading the description of his appearance, but that is how Domitian rather liked being portrayed. Domitian, born in 51 AD, therefore he is 30 when he becomes emperor. Nero was 17, Caligula, I think, was 25 or thereabouts. So Domitian is the third youngest emperor so far. He has a mixed reputation, or he has, I shouldn't keep using the word, but it's in the slides, he has a controversial reputation. For the immediate historians, for the historians who lived closest to his time, Tacitus and Suetonius, he was a monster almost without redeeming features. For modern historians, however, for historians since the end of the 19th century, he has emerged as an exemplary ruler. What is the truth? The truth, I don't know what the truth is. What are the probabilities then? The truth appears to be that Domitian was paranoid, but then who wouldn't be paranoid in that position? Indeed, look at this quote in the third paragraph. He used to say that the lot of emperors was most unfortunate, since when they discovered a conspiracy, no one believed them unless they had been murdered. The conspiracy is only generally accepted when people can see your blood-stained body lying on the marble floor of your palace. If you preempt the conspiracy by having half a dozen senators rounded up and executed, or put on trial before the Senate, it is, of course, oh, he's doing another purge, reign of terror, usual things. And Domitian did face a number of threats to his position. Of course, if it's your uncle or father or elder brother who is ordered to open his veins because he's been caught plotting against the emperor, you will regard him for the rest of your life as a tyrant. But Domitian was paranoid. He did have a large number of senators put to death, probably fewer than Claudius had, and Claudius has had generally a good reputation among the Roman historians. But apart from his paranoia, it seems that Domitian did keep a very tight control over the administrative machinery of the empire. We know that there were a number of very important and indeed fundamental reforms during his reign. One of them was his financial and monetary reforms. His gold and silver coinage was of great purity and elegance. He went up and down. First of all, he undid the debasement that took place in the later years of Nero, and he restored the gold and silver coinage as it had been in the reign of Augustus. He later found it necessary or useful, for various reasons we don't entirely understand, to go back to something like the standard of Nero. Because we don't have a complete history of the imperial budget, we don't know what impelled these changes in the metal standard of the coins. It may be that this was inflation, or it may be that it was a harmonization of the coins issued to circulate in the West with the coins that were circulating in the East to try to turn the empire into a single monetary zone. And the debasement under Nero and the re-debasement under Domitian do seem to fit that hypothesis, because once you take into account the debasements of Nero and the debasement or the re-debasement of Domitian, you find that the Western and Eastern coins are of the same weight and purity. But although Suetonius tries here and there to infer that Domitian was often short of money, there is no solid evidence of a fiscal crisis. It seems that the fiscal readjustments of Vespasian and Titus, and eventually of Domitian, put the empire onto a basis of solvency until the end of the next century, until the time of Septimius Severus, when it was necessary to increase the military budget beyond the empire's long-term capacity to afford it. There is no evidence of a fiscal crisis in the reign of Domitian. Domitian avoids foreign wars, and bearing in mind that one of his successors, Trajan, was a great conqueror, he extended the empire far north of the Danube. He also, for a few years, extended the empire all the way to the Persian Gulf. When you compare Domitian with Trajan, you see that Domitian is not terribly interested in wars, and an emperor is expected to be a rather military figure. Domitian's interest was to avoid foreign wars and to achieve his various ends by diplomacy and bribery. That being said, he did lay the basis for Trajan's later expansion north of the Danube. He also ensured that the conquest of Britain was completed. He made the decision to move the zone of Roman control up to something like the Scottish border, and though it might have been possible to take the whole of the island, he decided that what is now Scotland was not worth the effort of taking. He's also responsible for a number of valuable legal reforms. There was, all through the imperial period, a tendency towards a more humane treatment of slaves. Domitian advanced this considerably by banning the castration of slaves within the empire. Some of the historians make the catty remark that although he banned the creation of eunuchs, one of his lovers was a eunuch boy. But, well, hypocrisy is one thing, but he did ban the castration of slaves, and this appears to have been a ban which was completely effective for a very long time. There is a petition from the Egyptian rubbish dumps, a petition from a young Egyptian to the Roman governor asking for permission to be castrated because he needs a dispensation from the emperor's law. The governor writes back saying, no, you can't do that. Indeed, the church father, Origen, decided, because of a misreading, I think, of Matthew, for there are those who are born eunuchs, and others are made eunuchs of men, and others make eunuchs of themselves for love of the kingdom of God, etc. Origen decided that it was his duty to be castrated. He couldn't find a doctor to do the job, so he did it himself. That's a long-term consequence of Domitian's law against castration within the empire. There's some evidence, or there are claims, that Jews and Christians were persecuted later in the reign, but there is a solid toleration of all religions not considered harmful to public order or morality. There's one of the most famous buildings. There is the most famous building of the Flavian dynasty. This is built on the site of part of Nero's palace. Seen from our point of view, Nero's Golden House, indulgent though it was a much better use of the space than an arena used for the mass murder of people. But the Romans saw this as a much more respectable structure than an imperial palace. Built by Vespasian, opened by Titus, much patronized by Domitian. This is what they say about Domitian. He was tall of stature with a modest expression and a high colour. His eyes were large, but his sight somewhat dim. He was handsome and graceful too, especially when a young man, and indeed in his whole body, with the exception of his feet, the toes of which were somewhat cramped. In later life, he had the further disfigurement of baldness, a protruding belly, and spindling legs, though the latter had become thin from a long illness. He was only in his 40s when he was murdered, but people didn't live as long in those days. Suetonius also says of him, his conversation was polished, and some of his comments worth recording. For example, he once quipped, "How I wish I were as good-looking as Micius thinks he is," and again he compared a friend's red hair, which was turning white, to snow drenched with honeyed wine. We also have Domitian was diligent and conscientious in his administration of justice, often holding special sittings on the tribunal in the Forum. He rescinded decisions of the 100 made from self-interest, warned the arbiters not to allow fraudulent requests for the granting of freedoms, and penalized jurors found to have accepted bribes along with their co-jurors. This is entirely in character. All of the historians, all of the sources are clear that Domitian kept a very tight grip over the administration of justice and the administration of the empire as a whole. The dark side of his reign, however, Suetonius says, at the start of his reign, he spent hours alone each day, doing nothing but catch flies and stab them with the razor-sharp pen, which prompted a show of wit from Vibius Crispus, who, when asked if there was anyone with Caesar, replied, "No, not even a fly." I suppose a rather strange custom. Better flies than men, I suppose. Or here is a rather strange story from Dio Cassius, from the 3rd century, from 150 years after the events. He entertained the foremost men among the senators and knights in the following fashion. He prepared a room that was pitch black on every side, ceiling, walls and floor, and had made ready bare couches of the same colour resting on the uncovered floor. Then he invited in his guests alone at night without their attendants, and first he set beside each of them a slab shaped like a gravestone, bearing the guest's name, and also a small lamp, such as hang in tombs. Next, comely naked boys, likewise painted black, entered like phantoms, and after encircling the guests in an awe-inspiring dance, took up their stations at their feet. After this, all the things that are commonly offered at the sacrifices to departed spirits were likewise set before the guests, all of them black and in dishes of a similar colour. Consequently, every single one of the guests feared and trembled and was kept in constant expectation of having his throat cut the next moment. The more so, as on the part of everybody but Domitian there was dead silence, as if they were already in the realms of the dead, and the emperor himself conversed only upon topics relating to death and slaughter. Finally he dismissed them, and scarcely had each guest reached his home and was beginning to get his breath again, when one person brought in the slab, which was of silver, and then others in turn brought in various articles, including the dishes that had been set before them at the dinner. Last of all came that particular boy who had been the guest's familiar spirit, now washed and adorned. Thus, having passed the entire night in terror, they received the gifts. A strange story, a rather late story. It may be true. Now, what does it mean? Does it mean that Domitian was an insane tyrant? No, Domitian doesn't seem to have been insane. It may simply have been a warning to the various senators, keep your nose clean, or it'll be your funeral. Hard to say, but Domitian has a troubled reputation as emperor. He was killed by a palace conspiracy. I won't read it to you. You can read it for yourselves. Domitian had been assured by one of his astrologers that he was likely to die on a certain day before noon. So Domitian locked himself away for the whole morning of the day in question, and eventually he cried out, "What time is it?" And he was told that it was after the noon. No clocks in those days to look at. It was a question of crying out, "What time is it?" and being told where the sun was. He was told falsely. He came out to his locked room and was then murdered by his various attendants. When news of his assassination was reported to the Senate, at first everyone cried out in horror, demanding immediate justice for the killers, and this apparently was because everybody suspected it was a ruse. Domitian was announcing news of his death to see who would rejoice. But when eventually it was made clear that Domitian was indeed dead, there was apparently a great outburst of rejoicing, at least among the senators, and immediately one of Domitian's more trusted ministers and friends, Nerva, was elected emperor by the Senate and hailed by the army. Nerva was rather elderly, and no one expected him to last very long, and indeed he didn't. So he adopted Trajan. And once he'd adopted Trajan, Trajan was acknowledged by the Senate and by the army, and so when Nerva died, Trajan became the sole emperor. And so it carries on through this list. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius, and then of course Commodus. Perhaps we shouldn't mention Commodus. These are, with the exception of Commodus, these are the good emperors. We're entering on what all the historians at the time regard as the great days of the empire. A century of political stability and moderate government, when the empire was not beset by any great challenge and when there was no great crisis. Well, there was, because there was a Parthian war in the middle of the 2nd century, and typhus was carried from the east into the empire and seems to have wiped out a third of the empire's population. But apart from that, the next century was considered the high point of the empire. And Gibbon says, if a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. The vast extent of the Roman Empire was governed by absolute power under the guidance of virtue and wisdom. The armies were restrained by the firm but gentle hand of 4 successive emperors, whose characters and authority commanded involuntary respect. The forms of the civil administration were carefully preserved by Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the Antonines, who delighted in the image of liberty and were pleased with considering themselves as the accountable ministers of the laws. I'm seldom inclined to dissent from the authority of Gibbon, except to say that the time when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous is manifestly the present, isn't it? Even when you take into account all the various troubles we face. To quote the man who was Prime Minister in the year of my birth, "You've never had it so good." But let's move on from that. That is an overview of the Flavian dynasty and of the transition to the more settled conditions of the next century. Here is the empire as it was in 117 AD, that is, at the death of Trajan. You can see that the empire has been greatly expanded north of the Danube. The province of Dacia has been incorporated, from which I believe Romania draws its origin. Augustus and his immediate successors had regarded the Rhine and Danube as the natural boundaries of the empire along the north. The Flavians and their successors regard it as possible and desirable to expand those borders far north of the Danube. This area remains within the empire until I think the reign of Aurelian in the later 3rd century, when the borders were pulled back to the Danube, far more defensible against the new barbarian threat. The conquest of Mesopotamia and the establishment of the Roman borders on the Persian Gulf, that was an entirely temporary conquest of Trajan. Most of these gains were given up by Hadrian on his accession. But this is the empire as it emerged into the good years of the 2nd century. Now let's have a look at the Jewish War, one of the 2 big events of the Flavian dynasty. It began in the reign of Nero. Judea, indeed most of those areas to the south of Syria, were mixed areas. Large numbers of Jews, large numbers of Greeks. They hated each other, and there was competitive rioting between both communities. In 66 AD, according to Josephus, some Greeks performed a pagan sacrifice in Caesarea in front of a synagogue. This was a calculated provocation. The Jews protested to the Roman authorities. The Roman authorities said, well, what of it? They didn't do it inside the synagogue, so what's your trouble? The Jews didn't regard that as a satisfactory answer, and there was a cessation of prayers in the temple in Jerusalem for the emperor's health and general well-being. This then fed into discontent at the increase of taxes in the later years of Nero. Taxes increased for whatever reason. There seems to have been some kind of tax strike in Judea. The response of the Roman authorities was to march into the temple and to plunder it, a means of collecting unpaid taxes. Not a very wise thing to do. There was an immediate general revolt of the Jews. The Roman administrators and the pro-Roman Jews, including Herod Agrippa II, the king, they ran from Jerusalem. Also in 66, there was the Battle of Bethoron. the governor of Syria sent an army down to suppress this uprising. The army was taken by surprise and it was defeated by a Jewish militia. At this time, the whole of Palestine fell into the hands of a provisional Jewish government with its capital in Jerusalem. Josephus, the great historian, was in the first instance appointed commander of the armed forces. It looked as if the Jews had thrown off Roman government after a century of discontent, and that there would be an independent Israel. But it was an entirely fanciful dream for reasons that I discussed when we looked at the origins of Christianity. This is the geopolitical reality of the Near East. You have the Parthian Empire, which has obvious ambitions to establish a presence on the shores of the Mediterranean. It is not that far from the borders of this possible independent Israel. If the Romans were to consent to an independent Israel, there is not the slightest doubt that the rulers of Israel, indeed if you and I were the rulers of this Israel, we would do the same. There is not the slightest doubt that the rulers of this independent Israel would find it convenient to play off the Parthians and the Romans against each other to maintain their independence in the long term. The Romans, looking at this, realized that there was a strong possibility that an independent Israel would find it convenient to give a naval base to the Parthian Empire. And even if an independent Israel wouldn't do this, even if, like Armenia, it could be kept broadly pro-Roman, it's not something that you would like to trust to luck. So when the Jews rose and established their provisional Jewish government in Jerusalem, there was not the slightest chance that they would be left alone. Immediately, as I said, Vespasian was appointed commander of the expeditionary force. He was given an army of 80,000 men and full authority. He and his son were packed off to sort out this revolt, and they crushed it with Roman efficiency. In 67, Vespasian and Titus arrive in Syria with their 80,000 men. They sweep through the Jewish areas and they defeat all Jewish resistance except in fortified strongholds such as Jerusalem and Masada. In 70, after a long siege, and by when Vespasian has become the emperor and has left for Rome, Titus eventually breaks through the walls and destroys the entire city. When Titus breaks through the walls, he finds that a large fraction of the population has starved to death. The survivors are massacred, and those who are not massacred are taken prisoner and sold into slavery. The Romans then go about the careful demolition of the entire city. Not one stone is to remain standing on another stone. That is the end of Jerusalem. It is the end of even a semi-autonomous Jewish state in the Near East. It would not be until 73 that the last great stronghold at Masada would fall, when the defenders eventually committed suicide rather than be taken by the Romans. And I think the site was excavated in the 1950s by the Israeli state, but the Jewish revolt was crushed, and that was the end of it. A question: what were the Parthians doing throughout the Jewish revolt? If it was in their interests to give help to the Jewish rebels, why did they give no help to the Jewish rebels? I think, and we don't have the complete diplomatic history of the period, I suspect the Parthians missed their chance. If they had immediately recognized the provisional Jewish government in Jerusalem and had offered all necessary military support, it would have been very difficult for the Romans to do anything in the short term. However, bear in mind that in the later years of Nero, there was that settlement between the Parthian and Roman governments over the status of Armenia. Although the Parthians might have found it convenient to break that agreement and send an army into Syria, I should imagine that they were uncertain about it until too late. The moment Vespasian turns up with his vast army, it would be a very stupid thing to invade. But I do agree, if the Parthians had paid full attention to this and had recognized the provisional government in Jerusalem and had then given all military support, the Romans would have found themselves with something much bigger than an internal revolt. And this internal revolt itself took a lot of crushing. They would have found themselves with a Parthian army giving all necessary support to this Jewish provisional government, and we don't know how things would have worked out. But that is why the Roman authorities behaved so rapidly and so firmly and so ruthlessly and so brutally with the Jewish revolt. It had to be crushed, and so it was crushed, and it was crushed with great atrocity. And it is one of the big events of the century. Look, you got this from Luke 21, which oddly enough I was doing this morning with my New Testament Greek class. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, As for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? Then said he unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines, and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. There was, I believe, a comet in 68 AD, which prompted Nero to consider a massacre of the Senate. You then have a rather more prosaic description of the fall of Jerusalem in the Jewish War of Josephus. I believe Josephus was a witness to these events. He was taken prisoner by the Romans, and he ceased to be the general of the provisional Jewish government. Instead, he changed sides and spent the rest of the siege of Jerusalem going about the walls shouting, You must all surrender to the matchless power of Rome. Not a particularly dignified thing to do, but he did well out of it. He spent the rest of his life in Rome, placidly writing histories of his people and a history of the wars, and generally doing rather well. But he was a witness to this event. He writes as an eyewitness here, the terrible fate of Jerusalem. A question about who owned all the loot taken from Jerusalem. These belonged to the Roman state. The Ark of the Covenant, for example, is portrayed, I think, on the Arch of Titus. This was taken by Constantine when he established Christianity to Constantinople, where it remained on display in one of the places where holy relics were displayed until 1204, when the city was sacked by the Fourth Crusade, after which the Ark disappeared. We don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. It does seem to have been on display until the end of the 13th century. Perhaps it disappeared in the general burning of the city. We don't know. But the loot from the fall of Jerusalem, some of that was used to build the Arch of Titus. The other parts that weren't melted down for coin, they seem to have been retained by the imperial state as a property of the imperial administration, And as I said, the Ark of the Covenant was still in Rome in some kind of storage house until Constantine grabbed it, saying, "This is an object of the greatest holiness and significance. It's mine now, and it's coming to Constantinople to adorn my new capital." Mysteries, mysteries. There are claims that the Shroud of Turin was taken to Rome as part of the triumphal booty from the fall of Jerusalem. But of course, we don't know exactly when the Turin Shroud was made. We then have the other great event, the Great Disaster at Pompeii. This is a disaster because it killed many thousands of people. It is the greatest natural disaster of the century. It's the greatest natural disaster of several centuries either side. It's something that happens in one of the more fashionable parts of southern Italy. Rome itself in the summer is a disgusting place, and so everybody who has any money has a summer residence around the Bay of Naples. Look down here, you've got Capri, where Tiberius lived, but wealthy Romans would have villas all around the Bay of Naples, and those people who are not quite so rich would have a residence inside Pompeii or Herculaneum. What nobody knew was that the mountain, Mount Vesuvius, was a volcano. Oh, everyone knew that it was a volcano because it kept smoking, and every so often there was an earthquake, but there hadn't been a volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean world since about 1600 BC, when the big volcano of Santorini blew up. Since then, people had been familiar with Mount Etna, which was always bubbling lava over its edge, but nobody realized that volcanoes could just explode. Vesuvius was getting ready. At first, Pliny the Younger, who was in the area at the time, noticed that a cloud was coming out of Mount Vesuvius. He described it as looking like a tree with its branches right up in the sky. For us, we would recognize it as a mushroom cloud. What's going on is that because Vesuvius hadn't gone off for a very long time, the magma conduit was blocked by a plug of solidified rock. It's porous enough to allow smoke and some ash to force its way through. The main material is trapped underneath. For reasons that I don't understand, the magma is being forced upwards, and you're having enormous forces built up at the base of Mount Vesuvius. This is showing itself in periodic earthquakes until one day in August or October 79 AD, we're not quite sure which month, the whole thing blew and it released superheated tephra and gases to a height of 21 miles, ejecting pumice and molten rock at 1.5 million tons per second and releasing 100,000 times the thermal energy of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, something which nobody had expected. The Roman Navy, which is based at Misenum, 28 miles away across the Bay of Naples, sets out to take people who are trapped in their coastal villas. But here is the volcanic footprint. The wind drives the volcanic cloud in a southeasterly direction. Herculaneum is on the edge and Pompeii is right in the middle. Pompeii was under a continual rain of something like snow, ash raining down from the sky, falling and blocking the streets to several feet above the street level. Only towards the end do substantial amounts of solid rock start to drop from the sky. There's a description in Pliny's letter of how he and various other people tied cushions to their heads so that they could go about in public and not be brained by lumps of pumice stone dropping from the sky. Because there had been a big earthquake in the area about 18 years earlier, many people thought, oh, it's an earthquake, and so they didn't leave their homes. They wanted to stay and look after their property. They didn't realize what was going on. what did for Pompeii and Herculaneum was not so much the bombardment, it was the cloud of the superheated poison gas that swept down over these towns. Here's a video from the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. It's called a pyroclastic flow. It is superheated gas and solid ash moving at about 60 miles an hour straight down the mountain. There it is. You don't want to be in the path of that, and I believe these people didn't make it out. And that's what did for these people. They were gassed or cooked. They fell down dead in the streets, covered over with more ash, and then eventually the cavities in the ash could be carefully excavated, filled with plaster of Paris, and you have, there's an unfortunate man sat down leaning against a wall, trying to cover his eyes against the heat. There's a little child, a chained dog. We don't know what the population of Pompeii was, about 20,000 maybe. We found 1,500 bodies or thereabouts. It looks like most people got out, but a significant number of people were caught, and they were caught not by lava, but by that cloud of poison gas, that pyroclastic flow. It was an enormous event. The sun was blotted out for days in Rome. The smoke cloud was visible in Jerusalem. It was the greatest natural disaster of its age, and the whole area was deserted afterwards. Some efforts were made to dig down into Pompeii to recover lost property, but it seems that it was too deep and people were too scared. The area was abandoned and forgotten. Herculaneum, that didn't get the ash, that got the pyroclastic flow and then the lava. It seems several hundred people were sheltering in these boat houses on the seashore, thinking, we'll be safe enough, nothing will break through those great arches of brick. But they didn't take into account the pyroclastic flow, the superheated gas, which just poured straight in and killed them instantly. Apparently some of these skulls have exploded because the brains boiled inside them. However, although it was a nasty event for everybody who experienced it, once we began to excavate the site in the 18th century, all manner of wonderful things were discovered. Bronze statues for a start, things which had not hung around until the Middle Ages, when they could be seized and melted down for coins. No pitting from being hundreds and hundreds of years set up to be eroded by the elements. Everything was put as if into a deep freeze for 1,500 years and was dug out again in the 18th and 19th centuries. Fresh paintings on the walls. This is our main evidence for the quality of Greek and Roman painting. Oh, you've got mummy cases in Egypt, you've got some paintings from Nero's Golden House, but this is our main evidence for the technical skill of the artists. There, I believe, is the house of Caecilius, the moneylender. That's a modern reconstruction. We know a lot about Roman houses and the general architecture simply because we have Pompeii to look at. There are some nice, pretty objects, a baby's cot, carbonized wood, and a nice table, the sort of thing, again, that would not have survived the Middle Ages. More paintings, representation of a service outside the temple of Isis, a statue of Isis. It's the brothel pictures. I'm sure that those people who've been to Pompeii have seen all of these things. There's the fantasy, and on the right you have the reality. You've got narrow little cubicles with stone couches where the prostitutes or the sex workers may well have been chained in position. Not a pleasant life. And that, well, it looks like a carbonized turd, but it is actually a scroll. Thousands of these books so far discovered. Can't undo them, or couldn't undo them for centuries, but thanks to Hewlett-Packard, the technology is being developed so that we can scan them without destroying them. We can scan them, look inside them, 1/1000th of an inch at a time, and then unroll them virtually and try to recognize the ink on them. So far nothing wonderful has been discovered, but there may be tens of thousands of books still down there in Herculaneum, and we may have all sorts of wonderful things to discover. So there are the great events of the Flavian dynasty, and that's it. We've reached the end of our course on the early Roman emperors. I hope you found that useful or interesting. And although we seem to have run right up to the end, any comments or questions?